time. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Trita Parsi. He is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and also our senior correspondent, Osama bin Javed, is here with me in studio. Osama, let's start with you. Do we have any sense at this stage as to how the Pakistanis were able to make this happen?
Well, I think we need to all take a moment to let this sink in, that from the brink of and from the precipice of an all-out war of annihilation, the world has stepped back, as Donald Trump has announced it in his Truth Social post. You're hearing from the National Supreme Committee of the Iranians that on April 10th, a 2-week dialogue is beginning in Islamabad. I think that is the most significant outcome of all of this. This essentially underlines that they've agreed to this ceasefire. They've agreed to the terms that were presented to them. Now, the Americans are at a 15-point plan. The Iranians are at a 10-point plan. What the Pakistanis had been insisting all through this was that find common ground that you agree upon. Forget the parts that you disagree with. Find a strand that you agree upon. Come to the table, talk the other things out. The alternative is that you are going to go to war, spend billions of dollars, kill millions of people, put this region into a war that it might not be able to come out of for years, if not decades, and then you will, in the end, come to the table. And it seems that at the last moment, that sense seemed to have prevailed. And this is why you're seeing the Pakistanis being thanked by Donald Trump, they're acknowledged by the Iranians. And I think Islamabad being playing that crucial role, not just in the talks, but as a venue for negotiations, it is significant.
So you have a 15-point plan, a 10-point plan that we're trying to kind of reconcile here. Do we know at all where the points of disagreement may still lie?
Well, I think there's 25 points of disagreement between these two plans, because you see the maximalist positions that both sides have taken. They've dug their heels. The U.S. president knows that this is an election year. He is going to be able to have to sell to the American public that he went for a war that was, in his words, necessary and to prevent harm to Americans, whereas the Iranians are saying this was a complete war of choice. I was in Geneva when these talks were happening. The Iranians were quite confident that they've agreed to most parts of what was being put on the table. Going into this, they know now that for the last 6 weeks, they've been able to hold off and resist one of the largest armies in the world. They've been able to resist the Israeli attacks. They've went through a regime change operation, if the Americans want to call it that, whereas it took the Americans 20 years to replace the Taliban with the Taliban, but in the last 6 weeks, they've essentially replaced Khamenei with Khamenei.
Trita, you're there in D.C. I wonder, in your estimation, why do you think the president agreed to extend this ceasefire, or I should say, I guess, agreed to a ceasefire at all?
Because Donald Trump does not have any good options. He was talking a big game about escalatory steps, but everyone in the region knew that if he went after Iran's energy resources, power plants, etc., the Iranians would retaliate against GCC states, and we would have a much, much worse energy crisis than we have now. Oil prices would reach $200 in a prolonged way because oil infrastructure would be taken out, and this would destroy Trump's presidency. He needed to get out of this. He made these threats earlier today to give the appearance that the agreement that he would come to by this evening was done on his terms. But when you actually look at it, it does appear that it wasn't, because he, even in his own tweet, says that the negotiations are going to be based on the 10-point plan of the Iranians, which is a much more reasonable plan. It has a couple of very aggressive proposals, whereas the American plan was really maximalist from the beginning to end and really not a serious proposal. Now, that doesn't mean that these negotiations in any way, shape, or form are going to work. The Iranians are going to be tremendously suspicious that this is going to be the same thing the U.S. and Israel has done in Gaza several times. Use a ceasefire just to catch up, regroup, rearm, and then relaunch the war. So this is going to be very tough, and Pakistan has its work cut out for it. But we should all be thankful that there are still countries around that are willing to stick out their neck and use their diplomatic offices to help bring about some form of a reduction of tensions.
Who do you think's in a better bargaining position?
Well, I think at this point, the Iranians have managed to take away the potency of American military threats from this equation. Because even if the US continues to issue threats going forward in these talks, how serious would anyone take them after it's become so clear that the United States, with all of its firepower, still cannot bring the Iranians to their knees? The US Navy was 3,000 kilometers away from Iran's shorelines out of fear that Iranian missiles would sink a couple of American ships. So I think what has happened here is that the military option has been tested and it has failed. And this is going to change the dynamics in the negotiations in a profound way.
Osama, look, Iran has been insisting on basically reparations for the damage that's been done thus far in the war, and essentially saying, look, we should be able to turn the Strait of Hormuz into a toll road in order to pay for those reparations. Do you think that that is one point where they're likely to be flexible?
I think they will have to be flexible and they have been showing flexibility on that because they're working on a joint mechanism with the Omanis. You'll have to see the region come into play in all of this. You see, when I was saying that Pakistan is significant, it is not just because of its geography, but it is because of its ties. It's got a defense pact with the Saudis. Today, you heard the Pakistanis say that if there is an escalation, they will not abandon them. It has a line of communication with the Chinese, who essentially want free and safe passage because China is dependent on the Strait of Hormuz. It is not going to be willing to pay a premium to let its ships go past. So Iran will definitely be able to maintain some sort of control of the Strait of Hormuz, but I don't think that it's going to be millions of dollars each ship. But what is significant here is that this region has been changed forever. It is not just the United States that is leaving with a bloody nose. What has happened to Iran is extraordinary. What the blood force that has been hitting Iran. You're talking about the supreme leader being taken out. You're talking about the chain of command going fragmented. The new supreme leader, rumors about his health. So Iran will have to recalibrate and reassess because it was on the brink of seeing its regional powers, people who have so far refrained from conflict and shown, and you have to give the GCC a lot of credit here that it did not get dragged into this war as was being mentioned earlier. But now will be the time to reassess. This whole region will have to reassess its security and economic priorities. You're already seeing murmurs of avoiding the Strait of Hormuz and building pipelines and structures for the future. The damage that has been done is tremendous, and the region would not want to go back to it. Just in Qatar, the Ras Laffan trains that have been damaged, the liquefied natural gas trains, $26 billion worth of damage. In terms of revenues, about $20 billion a year for the next 3 to 5 years. There is tremendous toll, and that is just one of the oil and gas infrastructures that have been hit. So there is a lot at stake. I think all sides have now realized what this conflict costs, including the Americans and the Iranians, and these 15 days are going to be the litmus test whether they believe that the lessons learned will be applied to the future.
Trita, I want to ask you about a pretty remarkable answer that the president gave in his press conference yesterday in D.C. He was asked why the Iranians would go along with regime change when the Americans have been bombing their countries and were threatening to bomb, bridges, power plants, things like that. And President Trump said, quote, they'd be willing to suffer that in order to have freedom. And he insisted that there were actually Iranians who wanted the bombing to continue. Do you think that this deal is an acceptance that maybe that was hyperbole? Is the idea of regime change effectively dead here?
I think it is completely dead. And I think it was actually dead on arrival. And you can see it in the New York Times reporting today that was part of the proposal that the Israelis sold Trump that generated the most skepticism, outright skepticism. The CIA director called it farcical from Trump's advisors. Trump, it's not clear whether he fully was bought in on or not, but he clearly was bought in on the idea of war. He thought the regime was going to collapse. At this point, I think the Islamic Republic, the theocracy internally is stronger than it was before. And we may very well end up seeing a more hawkish, a more radical Islamic Republic version of the Islamic Republic going forward. That, I think, would be very devastating for the region as a whole, because as the previous guest mentioned, there is a dire need right now to make sure that the region comes together, builds its own security architecture, not dependent on outside forces, in order to make sure that they can safeguard the security in the region and never end up in a scenario like this again. And that's going to require flexibility from all sides, including the Iranians.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there. You heard our colleague Mohammed Val talking about the Iranian demands, one of them being that the war in Lebanon also ends. How likely do you think it is that that will ultimately be a sticking point? Because after all, this was never America's war. Americans have not been dropping bombs on Lebanon, only the Israelis have.
That is true. I think there's several reasons why the Iranians include this. One is to show their sympathy and solidarity with the people of Lebanon. But it's also important because if the Israelis continue to bomb Gaza, bomb Lebanon, bomb Syria, that is going to be a source of instability in the region that will in and of itself risk expanding the war onto Iran once again. And if you truly want to find an end to the war, not just a ceasefire, then it's necessary to recognize these connections between the theater in Lebanon and the theater in Iran. And as a result, I'm not surprised that they're making that demand. Now, whether the United States can deliver on that demand is a different story, if it wants to deliver on that demand. But there is a clear connection that we saw already from October 7th, that as long as those conflicts were continuing, the Israelis were bombarding these countries, the risk of regional spillover was massive. We have now seen it happen twice. If you want to avoid it in the future, you have to address that issue as well.
Osama, part of the irony of this conflict is that you had Israel bombing energy facilities inside of Iran, critical infrastructure inside of Iran just in the last 24 hours. And yet you had Saudi Arabia, which is no friend of the Israelis, that were ultimately taking the blowback from the Iranians for that. What do we know about the Gulf's role in pushing for a resolution to this? How involved have they been? What leverage have they had, and have they been able to effectively use it?
Well, in the last few days, I was in Islamabad talking to various sources about that particular point. And according to the Pakistanis, the role that they've been playing is not just of the mediator, but essentially going to Gulf states and convincing them that it is not in their interest to get involved and dragged into a war. One official told me that they reminded people of what happened in the 1980s, where Saddam Hussein was egged on to go to war with Iran, and then the ladder was pulled from beneath his feet. And that is why there's been wisdom, there's been determination to stay on the sidelines, even despite coming under attack. And you saw how angry the Saudi foreign minister was when there was a meeting in Tehran of foreign ministers of the region and the Iraqis and the Turks and the Pakistanis, and the Iranian bombs were falling on Riyadh and during that day. So the region has shown a lot of restraint, but that does not mean that it is going to be unlimited. That is why you're seeing from the GCC calls that they are going to be behind any sort of off-ramp that can be provided to Iranians and the Americans. But in the aftermath, the day after, they want to be part of a negotiated solution because they are ultimately paying the price. What they had built as shields around them, as the United States had told them, were essentially targets painted on their backs that the Iranians kept on hitting over and over again. And the United States was not able to give them the kind of cover that they expected that it was giving to Israel. Although the Americans said that, look, the 90% of interceptions you're making is because we are providing you with military hardware, and that relationship is not going to go anywhere. But I think what you're going to see in the region is more diversity, not just in economic ties, but in security ties as well. You're already seeing it with Turkey, you're seeing it with Europe, and now perhaps you'll see China become a player.
Trita, there's still a lot of question marks about the Israeli answer to all of this, but I just wonder, how likely do you think it is that we may find ourselves in a scenario where the Israelis ostensibly agree to a ceasefire deal, but then a few weeks later, when Washington's not paying attention anymore, they sort of go back to a bombing campaign in Iran, like we have seen, for instance, in Gaza, and previous to that, like we saw in Lebanon as well? How likely do you think that scenario is? And do the Americans really have the ability or the leverage over Israel to say no?
So on the first scenario, I don't think it is as easy for the Israelis to restart the war with Iran as it is for them to just bomb in Gaza and Lebanon. Because every time the Israelis have attacked Iran, they have had to coordinate with the United States because they need the US's help in order to protect them against the incoming retaliatory missiles from Iran. So I don't think that the Israelis actually can sustain themselves in a war with Iran without active American support. And if they are doing it against American wishes, then obviously they would take a huge risk of seeing potentially the United States stay out of that war. And then the Israelis facing Iran alone is not a scenario that they want to be in. Now, can the United States rein in Israel? Absolutely, it can. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that if the United States really wanted to, it would do so. The question is, what is the political price the president and his party would pay if they were to do so? And are they willing to pay that price? We have seen that Trump, on occasion, actually has reined in the Israelis in a rather humiliating fashion, such as when he forced them to read an apology to the emir of Qatar after the Israelis had attacked Doha. And then released the pictures of it to make sure that there was no doubt that this was actually happening. But we haven't seen Trump being able to sustain that pressure on the Israelis. And in this scenario, in order to make sure that this deal is sustainable, that pressure has to be sustained.
Yeah, how could you forget those photos of the president holding the base of the phone in the White House while the Israeli prime minister read his apology to the Qataris? All right, Trita Parsi there in Washington, Osama bin Javed here in Doha. Thank you both for that. We'll keep an eye